if I can remember what I wrote. I did think about this in a very interesting way here and there. I wanted to talk a little bit about speech today, and I wanted to kind of set a background for it. When I first started going to Sakya Monastery and Dharma Friendship Foundation, both places were talking about and teaching about the 10 non-virtues, which are not to kill, steal, have sexual misconduct, not to lie, have divisive speech, harsh speech, or idle talk, and not to have coveting, malicious intent, or wrong view. And I actually contemplating those, I've mentioned this before, for well over a year. I think it was more like a year and a half daily, and a lot of confusion just naturally dropped away from my life. The other thing that happened around that time was I was really attracted to Venerable Chodron's model of, and her teachings on ethics. I think that's really what drew me into becoming her student and actually living here. And as I've lived here over the years, we became able to do the pasada because we had enough monastics to do that, fully ordained monastics to do that. And now, so we do this bi-monthly confession. And I find now that this is my favorite group activity that we do, actually. This is my favorite. I always feel inspired when we do this. And part of it is the whole process that happens with that. When I moved here, before I moved here, Venables sat me down and said, you know, you need to be transparent to live here. And I didn't really even know what that was, to tell you the truth. But this value was taught, and then as we became monastics, it's kind of enshrined in the way we do pasada, which I love that we have to open up to ourselves, crack open, as they say, first to ourselves, our faults and our misdeeds, things like that. And you know, at first, you have to just sit there on the cushion and admit it to yourself before you can really say it to anyone else. And I think that process of looking at yourself and having a community where we hold this in a very much of a training. This is a training for our mind to hold precepts and to do these rites, and to also to then learn how to confess them, but it's held with so much compassion. And so it's helped me to be more honest with myself and more honest with others, I would say. And I love the space that we create for each other in that way. This helps us all to grow, and I always feel inspired by that because we could see it in ourselves. We have a lot to learn, and we have a way to learn. And this kind of method helps to promote harmony amongst individuals and within groups. And so this can be applied to anyone. You don't have to be a monastic to learn purification practices, which is essentially a very similar method. So speaking about the 10 non-virtues, what I like about them and what I like about Buddhism is I would say in one way you could say it sets a high bar. But actually what I think of it as, it's a lot of clarity of the Buddha of what leads to happiness and what leads to suffering. So the high bar in some ways is like stealing isn't just like taking something, it's like taking something that isn't freely given. Or what was mentioned the other day on a BBC, that speaking the truth is not just using words that are true, but it's also, are they beneficial? So it kind of raises our ethics in Buddhism is more than I grew up with. Let me put it that way. And I like that. I like that when you study these 10 non-virtues or the precepts, you learn a lot about what the Buddha thought would lead a person to be happy or lead them to suffering. And so I appreciate this clear guidance that we have. So in speaking about, and also I want to mention, because this kind of is something I don't fully understand yet, but these 10 non-virtues actually can lead a person to have a rebirth in a lower realm. And that sometimes seems hard when you think about idle talk, okay? But a complete I have to think about that more. But anyway, yesterday I engaged in idle talk, and I was very kindly helped by a community member, and I really appreciate that. I was kind of going along without enough mindfulness and introspective awareness in a conversation. And partly I realized as I thought about it, well, there was no lying, there was no divisive speech, there was no harsh speech. So I wasn't like tuning in to really what I was doing. I think that was partly why. It was just very factual. This is what happened, kind of thing. And I think that made it a little harder for me to stay on top of myself in that moment. So I may have started with a purpose, but I just drifted along with this conversation. It didn't have a purpose. And I really appreciate the feedback. It was very well handled and very simple and easy. I mean, she just kind of looked at me cross-eyed, and I'm like, oh, what are you doing? I'm like, yeah, what am I doing? It was like that. And, but I wouldn't have learned that without the training that we've had. And so in this regard, I think the Lam Rim has excellent teachings in it, and we've had excellent commentaries on it about the various kinds of speech. So I want to note for people that the person who helped me is not someone senior to me, right? Because sometimes this comes up in our community, and we were encouraged, the cohort of people that ordained around the time I ordained, we were very much encouraged not to think in terms of seniority. We're just like Venerable has told us a few times, you're all in the same bunch, you're all in the same age. And so I would say we don't want to let that get in the way of helping each other out. But then you do have to learn how to skillfully do that. And that takes some time. And so I thought I would share a few lessons of my bigger lessons in terms of speech. And one of the first ones I would say is, I guess I was thinking about this. A lot of this, what I'm going to talk about, comes down to motivation. And Dasha Rinpoche, who was one of my teachers, who's now passed away, I cannot remember him ever giving a Dharma talk without talking about motivation. Actually, every time he spoke about motivation. And I was thinking about that, how when you think about your motivation for speaking, how it really takes care of a lot of problems. Like, I was speaking with some people recently, and I've heard the word gossiping come up or talking behind another person's back. And I was like, all that is taken care of by looking at your motivation, because of course there are reasons to speak about somebody when they aren't in the room. There are definitely valid and important reasons to do that. Like you might have a medical condition. I mean, there's, a doctor would confer with other people to learn about something. They're talking about somebody else when they aren't in the room. I mean, life couldn't function without doing this. But it's a lot of this is what we're doing, what our motivation is. And sometimes we have a tendency actually not to look at what our motivation is when we do things, when we speak. And sometimes we actually aren't aware. I mean, I would say that's, when you come here, that becomes more apparent. Our training helps us to become more aware of that. But the thing with some of these things that people take in this way is it can break trust. But I would say that in this department, we should be aware, and this is something I've had to learn in my life, and I wasn't on top of this many decades ago. I used to think I knew what somebody's motivation was for something. I remember with a former partner, and when somebody corrected me on this and like, what, you're a mind reader or what? And we've learned that here in the community as well. You actually, a lot of times a person doesn't know their own motivation. So how could we think that we know what their motivation is? I mean, that's kind of like logically a non-starter in my mind. So I think that's good to be aware of that, like consciously aware of that, so that when something happens, I know Venerable Jigme used to say this to me. She used to say sometimes, you don't know that. Like I would say something when I was in my younger years here, and I'd have some probably projection on something, and she'd say, you don't know that. And I'm like, yeah, you're right, I don't know that. She was kindly pointing out to me what I was doing. So that was one thing. And then another big lesson for me was about my opinions. And so in 2015, I was having so much misery about this that I wrote it on one of my sadhanas, the date. And every day I looked at what I was doing with my opinions. I think I did that for 2 years, every day, because it sometimes takes me a while to learn things. And I really was having a lot of misery around this, and I wanted to change. But I needed a lot to figure that out. And again, in that, I think if we were looking at what our motivation was for offering our opinions on things, that goes a long way. Because from doing that reflection, I realized, well, actually, it's hard to go through a day here without offering your opinion on something, because oftentimes it's needed, but oftentimes it's not. So that was helpful. And then I also learned a lot through that, and also somewhat with studying nonviolent communication, was this urge to speak. I used to notice that in myself, this urge to speak that I could sometimes not always pull in. And with the nonviolent communication studies that we did, I took mostly that to the cushion more than any other way of using it. And once I became aware of what my needs were, this urge left. I knew what was going on inside of myself, so I could be more on top of myself, I would say. And I didn't actually know that before, and so sometimes generally I think I lived my life in a way that is fairly controlled, but I noticed things in living here where I had these urges that I sometimes couldn't control, like entering into conversations that I wasn't a part of, things like that. And, some things are conditioning and this and that, but that helped me a lot. So, so that helped me to reduce uncontrollable behaviors, most of which were speech. I didn't seem to have too often that come up with physical things, and I don't with the mind. Well, that's harder, The body is easier to control than the speech, which is easier to control than the mind. And then another point that I learned about was sometimes I really had a lack of understanding of the big picture, and I really am so grateful that I had help with this. And I've told some people this before, but when I first started going to the Sakya monastery, I didn't know. I was I didn't know I was arrogant, first off, and I didn't know that I was walking into a setting where you learn differently than you do in a classroom, where I was used to a certain way of interacting in classrooms. And so this kind Western monk told me very early on, and we didn't know each other well, he just said, "You really should shut up." He said it just like that. And, I had the wisdom to listen to him. And I just did, because I knew there was so much for me to learn there. I was in a different learning environment than anything I had been around. I was in a different culture that had different etiquette. And I had very little understanding of the Buddhist path. And so that was really good advice. And I have to say I didn't speak a lot for the first 2 years. And that worked to my benefit. Because I had a really lack of understanding of the big picture, of what I was entering into, how to go about it, anything and everything. There were just so many places. And it saved me all kinds of problems. And it gave me a chance just to listen and learn. And, I talk with my friends, but, I really did that differently. And so, sometimes I would say situations come up in our community where we actually don't have the big picture, and we don't actually know what's going on. And we may find that we maybe hear something, or somebody says something, or we witness something that we don't understand. And, I don't think the answer there is to go running around to everybody, da-da-da-da-da. I think really it's oftentimes when there's something you don't understand, oftentimes you might go to the source, and just kindly talk to a person and say, "Hey, I'm confused by this." Or you might go to your mentor, or there's just so many ways to handle this. But that, I think if you just know that you're oftentimes in a situation when you're in a new environment with a monastic code that we're just learning, that we actually don't know the big picture sometimes. I would say that I rely on Venerable Chodron, and she relies on her Vinaya masters to teach us the Vinaya. Why do we have teachers come all the way from Asia multiple times? I think we're up to about a half a dozen times now to teach us the Vinaya. we need the big picture. And this, it's a very long tradition. It's very nuanced. It has there's a lot there. It's not as simple as don't eat garlic, and you think you understand the precepts because you're not eating garlic. You've kind of missed the point. There's stories that go with all of our precepts. And so this comes up a lot. There's a lot there to the Vinaya, and we need to rely on Vinaya masters. So if you're someone who's living here who's not ordained, then do you really have the big picture? I don't have the big picture, so I think that would be hard to say. So I think it's good to understand that we get ourselves in trouble that way when we don't understand things well. And some of these things are very complicated and nuanced. And another place where I've seen a lot of growth in myself was one other great benefit of studying nonviolent communication was word choices. There are so many ways that we're just used to speaking that are not helpful. We use so much language that we were raised this way that's diagnostic, judgmental. I mean, we're just all the time, we're trying to connect with people, or we have a motivation to help somebody, or whatever it is. I mean, in this community, before we studied nonviolent communications, in the early years, we had some kind of community meetings that really ran afoul. And it wasn't because people's motivations weren't good, it's that our skills weren't very good. And so we needed to learn more. And this thing with word choices is hugely helpful because when you hear things from others, it can be very off-putting. And so, nonviolent communication really helps us to be more aware of what language we're using. So, yeah, I think that the last thing that's a big lesson for me here, and certainly didn't start this way, was telling my story to somebody, or Venerable Chodron in particular at first, or to anyone. Or people coming to me with their stories about something, or they have a problem with somebody, or this and that. And this happened a couple times recently where I told the person, well, my role here, and not just as a harmonizer, but also just as a community member, isn't actually to hear this story. My role is to help you to work with your mind. When somebody comes to me talking about somebody else, and I've certainly have done this more times than I can count in my life, but here I change the way I do this. My job, the way we do this in our life here is more, the person in front of me, they either need to help me work with my mind, or I'm helping them work with their mind. I'm not talking about other people. I'm not trying to change other people. That's not something you can really do. We can work with our own minds. And so I wanted to mention that just because I've said this twice in the last few months, and the person in front of me was quite surprised. They thought, you're a harmonizer, you're just supposed to fix this or something. And I'm like, no, I don't think so. We don't work that way. It's not our job. So these are just some of the things that come up around speech that I thought were worth mentioning. And I hope that if you're here, they might be beneficial. And if you're not here, that a lot of this stuff isn't necessarily related to monastic life. It relates to many settings that we live in with our family or friends, all kinds of places. So.